The camera glides over the vibrant Miami skyline at night, fireworks bursting brilliantly across the sky. It zooms into a luxurious penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows. Inside, the room is filled with opulence, a grand dining table covered in gourmet dishes and elegant decorations. In the middle of it all sits Eduardo, impeccably dressed in an expensive suit, but his expression is empty, his gaze fixed on nothing. Eduardo had everything: money, power, a view most could only dream of. But tonight, something was different. While the world celebrated the new year, he sat completely alone. None of it made sense until an unexpected encounter changed everything. The scene cuts to Joseph, the janitor, stepping into the penthouse with a look of awe and hesitation. What happens when two worlds so far apart collide? When a simple gesture can transform someone's destiny? You're about to witness a story that will move your heart. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, you'll find powerful stories that remind us what truly matters. Now, get ready for a journey of empathy and redemption, starting with a dinner no one could have predicted. The skyline of Miami glittered like 1,000 stars, its shimmering lights reflected on the calm waters of Biscayne Bay. The night was alive with distant sounds of laughter, car engines, and the faint melodies of holiday music drifting up from the streets below. Yet, inside the lavish penthouse perched atop one of the city's tallest buildings, there was only silence. Eduardo stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his silhouette framed by the glowing cityscape. His tailored shirt clung perfectly to his broad shoulders, his polished shoes reflected the muted light of the room, but his face betrayed no trace of satisfaction. He was a man who had everything: wealth, power, the freedom to do as he pleased, but tonight, he felt empty. A glass of vintage champagne sat untouched on the sleek marble counter of the open-plan kitchen behind him. The chef he had hired earlier in the week had prepared a feast fit for royalty: golden roasted turkey, truffle-infused sides, and a decadent assortment of desserts. Yet, Eduardo hadn't touched a single bite. The table, meticulously set with crystal glasses and fine china, looked like a museum exhibit: beautiful, extravagant, and completely lifeless. Pulling his phone from his pocket, Eduardo scrolled aimlessly through his messages. Nothing. No invitations, no cheerful "Merry Christmas" texts, not even a casual inquiry from someone wondering how he was spending the holiday. His inbox was as sterile as the gleaming surfaces of his penthouse. He tossed the phone onto the couch and rubbed his temples. For most of the year, Eduardo had thrived on being busy: meetings, negotiations, investments. The chase of success had consumed him entirely, leaving little room for personal connections. He thought back to how he had laughed off his friends' frustrations when he missed their weddings, skipped family gatherings, or cancelled dinner plans. "I'm building an empire," he had said, always with a confident smirk. "They'll understand." But tonight, as the world outside celebrated love, connection, and togetherness, Eduardo realized there was no one to share his empire with. He walked over to the grand piano in the corner of the room, running his fingers along its glossy black surface. He hadn't played in years, not since his mother used to beg him to perform at family Christmases. The thought of her warm laughter made his chest ache. He turned away from the piano, pacing toward the windows again. From this height, the people below looked like tiny sparks of light, moving through the city's arteries. Families gathered around glowing Christmas trees. Couples strolled hand in hand. Children clutched oversized teddy bears or brightly wrapped gifts. It was a scene Eduardo could see but not touch, as if he were watching from the other side of a glass wall. The penthouse itself, though exquisite, now felt like a cage. The polished wood floors, designer furniture, and priceless artwork on the walls, all of it seemed to mock him. What good was luxury if it couldn't fill the void inside? A soft chime interrupted his thoughts. At first, Eduardo thought it was a notification from his phone, but he realized it was the clock on the wall striking 11. In just 1 hour, the world would celebrate the arrival of a new year. A new chapter. But for Eduardo, it felt like another page in a book that was beginning to bore him. He glanced at the champagne glass again, then at the untouched feast. A wave of irritation swept over him. What was the point of all this excess if it went unshared? What was the point of it all? Without fully understanding why, Eduardo grabbed his coat from the back of a chair and headed for the elevator. The polished brass doors slid open silently, and he stepped inside. As the elevator descended, he leaned against the mirrored wall, studying his reflection. His dark eyes, once sharp with ambition, now seemed tired. The lines on his face, faint but present, told a story of late nights and constant stress. When the elevator doors opened into the lobby, the warmth of the space surprised him. Twinkling Christmas lights adorned the potted plants by the walls, and a modest tree stood in the corner, decorated with tinsel and handmade ornaments. It was nothing compared to the grandeur of his penthouse, but it felt alive. Eduardo's gaze landed on a figure hunched over by the front desk. It was Joseph, the building's janitor, dressed in a faded blue uniform. He was stacking cleaning supplies into a small cart, humming softly to himself. Eduardo had seen Joseph countless times over the years but had never really looked at him. For a moment, Eduardo hesitated. He wasn't sure why he'd come down to the lobby in the first place, and the idea of engaging in small talk felt foreign to him. But something about Joseph's presence, his quiet determination, made Eduardo pause. As he approached, Joseph looked up and smiled. "Good evening, Mr. Eduardo," he said, his accent soft but unmistakably Cuban. Eduardo nodded, surprised by the warmth in Joseph's tone. "Working late tonight?" he asked, the words feeling awkward on his tongue. Joseph chuckled lightly. "Always, sir. Someone has to keep things running, even on Christmas." Eduardo glanced at the cart, then back at Joseph. "No family to be with?" he asked, instantly regretting the question. Joseph's smile didn't falter, but his eyes grew wistful. "They're in Cuba," he said simply. "I send them what I can, but tonight is just me." Eduardo felt a pang of guilt. Here was a man who worked tirelessly, whose holiday consisted of cleaning floors and sending money across an ocean, while Eduardo had a feast and a view and still found a way to feel sorry for himself. He hesitated, unsure of what to say next. But as Joseph turned back to his work, Eduardo felt a sudden urge to keep the conversation going. Something about this moment felt important, though he couldn't yet explain why. The elevator hummed softly as Eduardo ascended back to the penthouse. His hands were shoved into the pockets of his coat, and his mind raced with fragments of thoughts he couldn't quite organize. The brief exchange with Joseph had unsettled him in a way he hadn't anticipated. For years, Eduardo had prided himself on staying detached, focused on results rather than relationships. Yet, the janitor's quiet resilience lingered in his mind. As the doors slid open, Eduardo stepped into the vast, empty expanse of his penthouse. The contrast hit him harder than before. The warmth of the lobby, with its modest decorations and Joseph's unassuming presence, now seemed more inviting than the pristine coldness of his luxury home. The sleek surfaces of the apartment reflected the city lights, but there was no life in them, no warmth to match the glittering glow. He walked to the dining table, where the untouched feast sat waiting. The roasted turkey, perfectly glazed and surrounded by an array of sides, looked almost staged, more an image from a magazine than a meal meant to be shared. Eduardo sank into one of the chairs, the leather creaking softly under his weight. He poured himself a glass of champagne and took a sip, but the fizzing liquid did nothing to dull the gnawing emptiness inside him. The stillness of the room was suffocating. Eduardo reached for his phone again, scrolling through contacts, looking for a name that felt safe to call. But every name on the list was either a business associate or someone he hadn't spoken to in years. He hovered over his sister's number, his thumb hesitating above the screen. The last time they had spoken was months ago, during a brief argument about their father's birthday party. She had wanted Eduardo to come, to set aside his work for just one day. But he had refused, claiming he was in the middle of an important deal. "You can't expect me to drop everything for a cake and candles," he had said, his tone dismissive. Now, as he stared at her name on the screen, the memory made him wince. He had always assumed there would be time to make up for missed moments, to repair the strained connections with his family and friends. But tonight, That assumption felt fragile, as if he had been gambling with something far more important than money. He set the phone down and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. His mind drifted to his childhood, Christmas mornings filled with laughter and the smell of his mother's cooking. His parents had always made an effort to create magical holidays, even when money was tight. Eduardo remembered the thrill of unwrapping gifts, even when they were simple things, a book, a toy car, a homemade scarf. He thought about his mother's voice, soft and reassuring, as she told him that happiness wasn't about what you had, but who you shared it with. He had scoffed at the idea as he grew older, convinced that success would bring its own kind of fulfillment. But sitting here now, surrounded by the spoils of his ambition, Eduardo couldn't deny how hollow it all felt. The sound of fireworks in the distance broke his train of thought. He glanced toward the window, where faint bursts of light illuminated the horizon. People were already celebrating, their voices rising in cheers that echoed faintly through the glass. Eduardo stood and walked to the window, pressing his palm against the cool surface. From this height, the city seemed so small, its chaos reduced to a gentle hum. But in the flickering lights of the fireworks, he could imagine the faces of the people below, families holding hands, children laughing, couples stealing kisses under the sparkling sky. He felt like an outsider, watching a world he no longer belonged to. For years, he had told himself that his sacrifices were necessary, that his relentless focus on work would eventually lead to something greater. But tonight, he couldn't remember what that something was supposed to be. The champagne in his glass had gone flat, but Eduardo drank the last of it anyway. He set the empty glass down and wandered to the piano in the corner of the room. He ran his fingers over the keys, their smooth surface cool to the touch. He hadn't played in years, not since his mother's death. She had been the one to teach him, patiently guiding his small hands over the keys, encouraging him even when he hit the wrong notes. Eduardo pressed a single key, the sound echoing softly through the penthouse. It was a simple note, but it stirred something in him, a memory he had buried long ago. He closed the piano lid and stepped away, unable to face the weight of the emotions it brought up. Instead, he paced the room, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors. He found himself drawn back to the interaction with Joseph, replaying the janitor's words in his mind. There in Cuba, Joseph had said, his voice steady but tinged with longing. I send them what I can, but tonight is just me. Eduardo couldn't shake the image of Joseph stacking cleaning supplies, humming to himself as if content with the small joys life had to offer. It was a stark contrast to Eduardo's own restless dissatisfaction. How could a man with so little seem so at peace, while Eduardo, with all his wealth, felt so lost? The question gnawed at him as he wandered back to the dining table. He picked up a piece of bread from the basket and tore it apart absent-mindedly, his mind still turning over Joseph's words. For the first time in years, Eduardo felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't joy, but it wasn't despair either. It was a strange, unfamiliar urge to do something that mattered. He glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. The thought of ringing in the new year alone suddenly felt unbearable. Without fully understanding why, Eduardo grabbed his phone and headed for the door. As the elevator carried him back down to the lobby, Eduardo's reflection stared back at him from the polished walls. He hardly recognized the man he saw, a man who had spent years building walls to keep others out, only to realize he had trapped himself inside. When the doors opened, the warmth of the lobby greeted him once again. The Christmas lights still twinkled, their soft glow casting shadows on the walls. Joseph was still there, wiping down the front desk with a cloth. He looked up as Eduardo approached, his expression curious but welcoming. Mr. Eduardo, Joseph said, his voice tinged with surprise. Is everything all right? Eduardo hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I was just thinking, he began, his words slow and measured, it's a shame to waste a feast like the one I have upstairs. Would you like to join me? Joseph blinked, clearly caught off guard. Join you, sir? Yes, Eduardo said, his voice firming. It's Christmas, after all. No one should spend it alone. Joseph studied him for a moment, then smiled, a warm, genuine smile that softened the lines of his face. "I'd be honored," he said simply. As the two men stepped into the elevator, Eduardo felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, he wasn't running from his thoughts. He was taking a step towards something real. The elevator doors opened into Eduardo's penthouse with a soft chime. Joseph hesitated on the threshold, his weathered hands clutching the edges of his janitor's cart as if seeking something familiar to ground him. His eyes widened slightly, scanning the opulent space, the glinting fixtures, and the vast expanse of glass that framed the Miami skyline. "It's beautiful," Joseph murmured, almost to himself. His voice carried a mix of awe and hesitation, as if he felt out of place in such a setting. Eduardo stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. "It's just a space," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. He had always prided himself on the grandeur of his home, but tonight, he couldn't help but see it through Joseph's eyes, cold, unwelcoming, and devoid of life. Joseph left his cart by the elevator and stepped cautiously onto the polished floors. His shoes squeaked slightly, and he immediately stopped, looking down as though worried he might leave a mark. Eduardo noticed the gesture and waved it off. "Don't worry about that," Eduardo said, walking toward the dining area. "Come on. Sit." The dining table, illuminated by the soft glow of pendant lights, was a masterpiece of culinary excess. Every dish had been prepared to perfection, from the golden brown turkey to the meticulously arranged sides of roasted vegetables and artisanal bread. Crystal glasses sparkled next to fine china, and the faint aroma of truffle and thyme lingered in the air. Joseph approached slowly, his gaze darting between the table and Eduardo. "Are you sure, Mr. Eduardo? This is too much for me." "It's just Eduardo," he corrected, pulling out a chair. "And it's Christmas. No one should eat alone on Christmas." Joseph nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he lowered himself into the chair Eduardo had offered. He clasped his hands in his lap for a moment, then looked up at Eduardo with a small smile. "Thank you. It's been a long time since I've had a real Christmas dinner." Eduardo took a seat across from him, pouring 2 glasses of champagne and sliding one toward Joseph. "A toast?" Eduardo suggested, lifting his glass. Joseph hesitated, then picked up the delicate flute with careful hands. "To what, sir?" Eduardo thought for a moment. "To new beginnings, I suppose." Joseph smiled again, the lines around his eyes softening. "To new beginnings." Their glasses clinked, the sound small but significant in the vast quiet of the penthouse. As they began to eat, Joseph's initial hesitation faded. He marveled at the food, praising the flavors and the presentation, though he kept his bites modest. Eduardo watched him, feeling an unexpected warmth in the simplicity of Joseph's gratitude. "You've worked in this building for a long time, haven't you?" Eduardo asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Joseph nodded, setting down his fork. 7 years now. I came here after things got harder back home in Cuba. It's not easy, but it's honest work, and it helps my family." Eduardo leaned back in his chair, curious. "You send money back?" "Every month," Joseph said. "It's not much, but it keeps my wife and kids going. My youngest just started school. She's smart, like her mother. Always asking questions, always wanting to learn more." His face lit up as he spoke, his pride unmistakable. For a moment, Eduardo felt a pang of envy, not for Joseph's life, but for the depth of connection he seemed to have with his family. Despite the distance and hardship, Joseph spoke of them as though they were right there with him, a part of his every decision and effort. "You must miss them," Eduardo said quietly. "Every day," Joseph replied. "But we make it work. We talk when we can, and I write letters. It's not the same, but it's enough to remind me why I'm here. Why I keep going." Eduardo looked down at his plate, pushing a piece of turkey around with his fork. The contrast between their lives felt almost absurd. Here was a man who worked tirelessly for a life he couldn't fully enjoy, while Eduardo, with all his wealth and freedom, had isolated himself from everyone who had ever mattered. you're lucky," Eduardo said after a moment. Joseph blinked, clearly surprised. "Lucky, sir?" Eduardo nodded. "You have something real. A reason to keep going. People who care about you." Joseph studied him for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "And you, sir? You have no one?" The question hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortably direct. Eduardo opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. He wasn't sure what to say. Admitting the truth felt too raw, too vulnerable. Even after everything they had shared that evening, Joseph seemed to sense his hesitation. "Forgive me," he said softly. "It's not my place to ask." "No," Eduardo said quickly, shaking his head. "It's fine. It's just. I don't know. Somewhere along the way, I lost track of things. Of people. I told myself it was necessary, that success meant sacrifice. But now," he trailed off, gesturing vaguely to the empty room around them. "Now, I don't know what it was all for." Joseph leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "You still have time, Eduardo. Time to rebuild. To make things right." Eduardo frowned, the weight of those words settling on him like a challenge. Could it really be that simple? Could he undo years of neglect and selfishness with a few phone calls, a few gestures of reconciliation? "I don't even know where to start," he admitted. "Start small," Joseph said. "A kind word. A small gesture. It doesn't take much to make a difference. Sometimes, it's the little things that mean the most." Eduardo stared at him, struck by the sincerity of his words. He had spent so long chasing big achievements, monumental successes, that he had forgotten the value of the small, simple acts that connected people. As the evening wore on, their conversation drifted to lighter topics: Joseph's favorite dishes from Cuba, Eduardo's travels, stories of unexpected kindness from strangers. Eduardo found himself laughing, a sound that felt unfamiliar but welcome. When midnight approached, Eduardo stood and walked to the window. The city below was alive with celebration, fireworks bursting in brilliant colors over Biscayne Bay. He motioned for Joseph to join him, and together they watched the sky light up, their reflections blending in the glass. As the final burst of fireworks illuminated the skyline, Eduardo turned to Joseph. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what, sir?" "For reminding me of what matters," Eduardo said. "And for spending tonight here, with me. I don't think I would have made it through alone." Joseph smiled, his expression warm. "Sometimes, all we need is a little company." As the last of the fireworks faded, Eduardo felt something shift within him. For the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of hope, a sense that the new year might bring something more than just another set of goals and achievements. It might bring connection, meaning, and perhaps, even redemption. The soft hum of the city outside provided a quiet backdrop as Eduardo and Joseph sat at the dining table, the remnants of their feast spread between them. The initial awkwardness had long faded, replaced by an unexpected ease in their conversation. Eduardo poured another glass of champagne for Joseph, who hesitated briefly before accepting it with a grateful nod. "You've had an interesting life," Eduardo remarked, leaning back in his chair. He swirled the champagne in his glass, watching the bubbles rise. 7 years in this building, and I never knew anything about you." Joseph chuckled, the sound light but tinged with humility. "Most people don't ask, sir. My job is to stay in the background, make things work without being noticed." "Eduardo," he corrected again, though Joseph's insistence on formality brought a small smile to his face. "And what about before? Before you came here?" Joseph's eyes softened as he set his glass down. He rubbed his hands together, his rough fingers a testament to years of hard work. "Back in Cuba, life was different. We didn't have much, but there was always love. My wife, Maria, is the strongest woman I know. She held everything together when things got tough. And my kids, they're my heart. They remind me why I keep going, even when I want to stop." Eduardo leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "But you left them," he said carefully, his voice curious rather than judgmental. "Why?" Joseph's expression grew distant, his gaze fixed on the flickering candle between them. "Because I had to," he said simply. "The economy back home, it's hard to explain. There's no opportunity, no way to give my family what they deserve. I come here, I work, I send money back. It's not the life I wanted, but it's the life I chose for them. To give them something better." Eduardo frowned slightly. The thought of leaving behind everything and everyone he cared about felt foreign to him, even as someone who had distanced himself emotionally. "Do they understand?" he asked. "They do," Joseph said with a small nod. "But that doesn't make it easier. My daughter cries sometimes when we talk on the phone. She asks why I can't come home. My son pretends to be strong, but I know he misses me. And Maria, she never complains, but I can see it in her eyes when we video call. She's carrying so much on her shoulders." There was a pause as Eduardo absorbed Joseph's words. He had spent years thinking that success was measured by how much you could accumulate, by how far ahead you could get. But sitting here, listening to Joseph, he realized there was a different kind of strength in sacrifice, a strength he had never truly understood. "You've given up so much," Eduardo said quietly. Joseph shrugged, his smile returning. "It's not about what I've given up. It's about what they've gained. My kids go to school. They have clothes, food, books. Things I never had growing up. That's what matters." Eduardo looked down at his hands, his thoughts swirling. He thought about his own upbringing, modest but happy, filled with family gatherings and laughter. He had been so focused on escaping the limitations of his childhood that he had lost sight of the things that had truly mattered. "You're a good man," Eduardo said finally, his voice sincere. Joseph laughed softly, shaking his head. "I don't know about that, sir. I just try to do what's right." "And you think that's enough?" Eduardo pressed. "Just doing what's right?" Joseph tilted his head, considering the question. "It's not about being perfect or always knowing the answers. It's about trying. Every day, you try to do a little better. Be a little kinder. Help where you can. That's what makes life meaningful, I think." The simplicity of Joseph's philosophy struck Eduardo like a physical blow. He had spent so much time chasing perfection, perfect deals, perfect investments, a perfect image of success, that he had forgotten how to appreciate the small, imperfect moments that made life worth living. "You make it sound so easy," Eduardo said, his tone carrying a hint of disbelief. Joseph smiled knowingly. "It's not easy, Eduardo. But it's worth it." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling over them. Eduardo found himself replaying Joseph's words in his mind, feeling a strange mixture of shame and hope. Shame for the years he had wasted on superficial goals, and hope that it wasn't too late to change. As the minutes ticked by, their conversation shifted to lighter topics. Joseph shared stories of his childhood in Cuba, running barefoot through the fields, climbing mango trees, and sneaking into the ocean with his siblings. His eyes lit up as he spoke, the memories clearly dear to him. Eduardo found himself laughing at Joseph's anecdotes, the sound surprising him. It had been so long since he had laughed, really laughed, that he had almost forgotten what it felt like. "You should visit Cuba someday," Joseph said, his tone light but genuine. "It's not perfect, but it's beautiful. The people, the music, the food, there's a spirit there you won't find anywhere else." "Maybe I will," Eduardo said, though he wasn't sure if he meant it. "You'd like it," Joseph said with a nod. "It's a good place to learn what really matters." As the clock neared midnight, Eduardo stood and walked to the window. The city below was alive with anticipation, the streets buzzing with energy as people prepared to welcome the new year. Fireworks had begun to light up the sky, their brilliant colors reflecting on the surface of Biscayne Bay. Joseph joined him, standing a respectful distance away. Together, they watched the display in silence, the bursts of light painting the night with fleeting brilliance. When the clock struck 12, the sound of cheers and celebration echoed faintly from the streets below. Eduardo turned to Joseph, a sudden sense of urgency welling up inside him. "Joseph," he said, his voice steady, "you've given me a lot to think about tonight." Joseph looked at him, his expression warm but humble. "I'm glad I could help, sir." Eduardo shook his head. "It's more than that. You've reminded me of something I've lost, something I didn't even realize I was missing." "Thank you." Joseph smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "It's never too late to find it again, Eduardo." As the final bursts of fireworks lit up the sky, Eduardo felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. He didn't know what the new year would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face it, not as the man he had been, but as the man he wanted to become. The last of the fireworks had faded from the Miami skyline, leaving a shimmering afterglow in the humid night air. Eduardo and Joseph remained by the grand window of the penthouse, their reflections blending into the cityscape. A quiet, almost sacred stillness had settled between them, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Eduardo turned away from the view and gestured toward the dining table. "There's still plenty left to eat," he said, his voice soft but inviting. "You barely touched anything earlier. Sit, relax, and enjoy." Joseph hesitated, glancing at the table. "It feels strange, sir." "I mean." "Eduardo," he corrected himself, the word still unfamiliar on his tongue. "I've never had a meal like this, not even back home." Eduardo smiled faintly and walked back to the table. "Then it's about time," he said, pulling out a chair and motioning for Joseph to sit. "I insist." Joseph eventually nodded, his shoulders relaxing as he took the seat. Eduardo poured him another glass of champagne, and Joseph accepted it with a shy smile. They began eating again, the earlier stiffness in their conversation replaced by a surprising ease. Eduardo, who had spent countless business dinners mastering the art of small talk, found himself asking questions he genuinely cared about for the first time in years. "Tell me about your family," Eduardo said, slicing a piece of turkey. "What do they like? What makes them happy?" Joseph's face brightened at the mention of his loved ones. He set his fork down and leaned back slightly, his hands resting on the table. "My son, Diego, he loves to draw. He's always sketching something: animals, cars, the ocean. He has a good eye for it. I send him pencils and notebooks whenever I can." Eduardo nodded thoughtfully. "And your daughter?" "Lucia," Joseph said, his voice softening as he spoke her name. "She's the curious one. Always asking questions about the world. She wants to be a teacher someday, like her mother used to be before." He trailed off, his expression momentarily clouding. Eduardo noticed but didn't press. Instead, he asked, "What about your wife? Maria, wasn't it?" Joseph's smile returned, though it carried a trace of longing. "She's the glue that holds everything together. Even from so far away, she makes it all work. She tells me not to worry about them, but I know how much she sacrifices. She's the strongest person I know." As Joseph spoke, Eduardo couldn't help but compare the warmth and connection in his words to the cold distance in his own life. The love Joseph had for his family was palpable, a steady flame that endured despite miles and hardships. Eduardo realized he couldn't remember the last time he had spoken about someone with such affection. "What do they say about you being here?" Eduardo asked, leaning forward slightly. Joseph took a sip of champagne and shrugged. "They miss me, of course. But they know why I'm here. They understand that I'm doing this for them. It's not easy, but it's what's needed." Eduardo frowned. "But don't you ever feel cheated? Like you're giving so much, and you're the one missing out?" Joseph considered the question for a moment, then shook his head. "There are days when it's hard. Days when I wonder if it's worth it. But then I hear my kids laugh, or I get a letter from Maria, and I know it is. It's not about me, Eduardo. It's about them. If they're happy, that's enough." The simplicity of Joseph's answer struck Eduardo like a blow. He had spent his life chasing happiness in all the wrong places: money, status, power, only to find himself more isolated with each success. The idea that happiness could come from something as simple as another person's smile felt almost revolutionary to him. For a while, they ate in companionable silence, the weight of their conversation settling over them like a shared understanding. Eduardo found himself savoring the food in a way he hadn't in years, not because of its richness, but because of the moment itself. When they were both too full to continue, Eduardo pushed his plate aside and leaned back in his chair. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice measured, "about what you said earlier, about small gestures making a difference." Joseph tilted his head slightly, his expression encouraging. "I've spent so long focusing on, well, everything except people," Eduardo admitted. "Friends, family, even the people who work for me. I've always thought big deals, big projects, big wins. But I think I've missed the point." Joseph smiled, his eyes kind. "It's never too late to change." Eduardo chuckled softly. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," Joseph said, his tone gentle but firm. "It's a choice you make every day. To care, to show up, to give what you can. Some days, you'll get it right. Other days, you won't. But you keep trying. That's what matters." Eduardo nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. He had spent so much of his life striving for perfection that the idea of simply trying, of embracing imperfection, felt almost foreign. As they continued talking, Eduardo found himself sharing more than he had intended: memories of his childhood, regrets about his estranged relationships, and even his fears about the future. Joseph listened without judgment, offering only quiet words of encouragement when needed. The conversation flowed late into the night, the boundaries between employer and employee dissolving into something resembling friendship. Eduardo realized how much he had underestimated Joseph, not just as a worker, but as a person. Eventually, the clock on the wall chimed softly, signaling the early hours of the morning. Eduardo glanced at it and smiled. "It looks like we've celebrated the new year properly," he said. Joseph chuckled. "It's been a good night, Eduardo. Thank you for inviting me." "No," Eduardo said, shaking his head. "Thank you, Joseph. You've reminded me of something I'd forgotten: what it means to be human." Joseph stood, smoothing the front of his uniform. "Well, if that's the case, I'd say it was a Christmas well spent." Eduardo followed him to the elevator, his heart lighter than it had been in years. As the doors closed behind Joseph, Eduardo returned to the dining table and surveyed the scene. The empty plates, the half-finished champagne, the lingering warmth of the conversation, they all felt like remnants of something important, something real. For the first time in years, Eduardo felt a flicker of hope. Hope that he could rebuild what he had lost, that he could find meaning beyond the walls of his penthouse. And as he stood there, the faint light of dawn creeping into the sky, Eduardo made a silent promise to himself: this was only the beginning. The elevator doors closed softly behind Joseph, and Eduardo stood in the silence of his penthouse, watching the floor indicator descend until it reached the lobby. For a moment, he remained still, the events of the night replaying in his mind like fragments of a dream. He looked around the vast, empty space, the extravagant feast, the polished floors, the glittering city lights beyond the windows, and for the first time, he saw his home as something different. That it wasn't a palace. It wasn't a symbol of success. It was a shell. He walked back to the dining table and began clearing the plates, stacking them with care as though the simple act carried more weight than it should have. The quiet clinking of glass and porcelain echoed faintly, a rhythm that matched his thoughts. For years, Eduardo had believed that his achievements could speak for him, that the size of his penthouse, his car, and his bank account would tell the world who he was. But tonight, Joseph's words had unraveled that illusion. "It doesn't take much to make a difference," Joseph had said, his voice steady but unassuming. Those words clung to Eduardo like an anchor, pulling him into reflection. After loading the last plate onto the marble countertop, Eduardo paused. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the counter, his head bowed. His mind raced with images, the empty seats at the table, the untouched champagne glasses, and Joseph's humble smile as he spoke about his family. For all his wealth, Eduardo realized, he had been the poorest man in the room. Straightening, Eduardo turned back toward the window. The city sparkled below, its ceaseless energy like a heartbeat. Somewhere down there, Joseph was likely returning to his duties, pushing his cleaning cart across the glossy floors of the lobby. The image struck Eduardo with unexpected clarity. The contrast between their lives was stark, but for the first time, he didn't feel superior. He poured himself a glass of water, his champagne now forgotten. Taking a slow sip, he allowed himself to sink into the solitude of the moment. Solitude was something he had always told himself he needed, a requirement for success. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, it felt heavy. As the first light of dawn began to streak the sky with pale pinks and oranges, Eduardo made his way to the piano in the corner of the room. He hadn't touched it in years, but the sight of it now stirred something in him. He sat down on the bench and ran his fingers lightly over the keys. The instrument had been his mother's pride and joy, a symbol of the modest but vibrant family life they had shared when he was young. She had been the one to teach him, patiently guiding him through his mistakes until the notes came together in harmony. Closing his eyes, Eduardo pressed a single key. The soft, resonant sound filled the room, mingling with the faint hum of the city waking up below. Another note followed, then another, until Eduardo found himself playing a melody he had nearly forgotten. It was a simple tune, one his mother used to hum while baking during the holidays. The memory brought an unexpected lump to his throat. When the melody faded, Eduardo sat in silence, his hands resting on the keys. He thought about Joseph's words, about the quiet strength of a man who had so little yet gave so much. And he thought about himself, the man who had everything but had forgotten how to give. The idea came to him slowly, like a candle flickering to life in the darkness. He didn't have to stay trapped in the isolation he had created. He could do something different. He could start small, just as Joseph had suggested. Setting his jaw with a newfound determination, Eduardo stood and walked to his desk. He pulled out a notebook, one of the many he used to jot down investment ideas, and flipped to a blank page. With a pen in hand, he began to write. The first entry was a list of people. His sister. His father. A few old friends whose numbers he still had saved in his phone. People he had pushed away, either intentionally or by neglect. Next to each name, he wrote a single action he could take, a phone call, a visit, a letter. Something tangible to begin mending the bridges he had burned. The second entry was for strangers, people he didn't know but could still help. Inspired by Joseph, Eduardo scribbled ideas for small acts of kindness, donating to shelters, funding local schools, helping families struggling to make ends meet. The list grew quickly, and with each item, Eduardo felt a spark of purpose reigniting inside him. When he finished, he set the notebook aside and leaned back in his chair. The sun had fully risen now, bathing the penthouse in warm, golden light. For the first time in years, Eduardo didn't feel trapped by the walls around him. Instead, he felt a sense of possibility, as though the space could be transformed into something meaningful. Later that morning, Eduardo took the elevator down to the lobby. He found Joseph wiping down the front desk, his movements methodical but unhurried. "Joseph," Eduardo called out, his voice carrying across the quiet space. Joseph looked up, surprised to see Eduardo again so soon. "Good morning, sir. You're up early." Eduardo walked toward him, his steps purposeful. "I didn't get the chance to say it properly last night, but thank you," he said, extending his hand. Joseph hesitated for a moment before grasping Eduardo's hand in a firm shake. "It was my pleasure, Eduardo," he said with a warm smile. Eduardo glanced around the lobby, his eyes landing on the modest Christmas decorations that still adorned the walls. "You've given me a lot to think about," he said. "And I've decided to take your advice." Joseph raised an eyebrow. "Which advice was that?" "To start small," Eduardo replied. "To try, even if I don't get it right. To care." Joseph's smile widened, and he nodded approvingly. "That's all anyone can do." Eduardo reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. "I want you to have this," he said, holding it out to Joseph. Joseph blinked in surprise, his hand hesitating before taking the envelope. "What is it?" "Consider it a Christmas bonus," Eduardo said. "But more than that, consider it a thank you, for reminding me of what really matters." Joseph opened the envelope carefully, his eyes widening as he saw the check inside. His lips parted as if to protest, but Eduardo raised a hand to stop him. "You deserve it," Eduardo said firmly. "You've done more for me than I can explain, and I want to do something for you in return." Joseph looked at the check, then back at Eduardo, his eyes glistening with gratitude. "Thank you, Eduardo. This means more than you know." As Eduardo left the building that morning, he felt lighter than he had in years. The sun was warm on his face, and the city buzzed with life around him. For the first time in a long time, Eduardo wasn't thinking about deals or deadlines. He was thinking about people, his family, his friends, and the strangers he had yet to meet. And as he walked down the street, Eduardo realized that Joseph was right. It didn't take much to make a difference. All it took was the decision to care. The soft glow of the Miami sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Eduardo's penthouse, casting warm rays across the polished floors. The remnants of the Christmas feast were still on the table, but they no longer felt like symbols of waste or emptiness. Instead, they carried the memory of an extraordinary night, one that had brought unexpected companionship and a quiet revelation. Eduardo stood in the center of the living room, holding his phone in his hand. The screen displayed the name of his sister, her number still saved from years ago. His thumb hovered over the call button. He had stared at it for several minutes, his pulse quickening at the thought of what he might say. The last time they'd spoken had been tense, filled with words he now regretted. She had wanted him to be there for their father's birthday, to put family before business just once. But Eduardo had been dismissive, brushing off her pleas with cold practicality. Now, standing alone in his penthouse, her absence felt sharper than ever. Taking a deep breath, Eduardo tapped the button. The phone rang twice before her familiar voice answered, cautious but curious. "Eduardo," she said. "Hey, Sophia," he replied, his voice quieter than he had intended. I wasn't sure if you'd pick up." There was a pause on the other end, and he could hear the faint sound of children laughing in the background. "It's been a while," she said, her tone neutral but not unkind. "I know," Eduardo admitted, pacing slowly as he spoke. I've been terrible at keeping in touch. That's on me." Sophia didn't immediately respond, and Eduardo could feel the weight of the years between them. He continued before she could say anything. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he said, stopping by the window. "For missing Dad's birthday, for not being there when it mattered. I've been so focused on work that I forgot what really matters. And I'm sorry for that." Her silence was deafening, and Eduardo felt his chest tighten. But when she finally spoke, her voice was softer, warmer. "Thank you, Eduardo," she said. "That means a lot to hear." Encouraged, he pressed on. "I want to do better," he said earnestly. "I don't want to keep making the same mistakes. And I'd really like to see you. Maybe we could plan something soon." Sophia hesitated, but only briefly. "That would be nice," she said. "The kids would love to see their uncle. They've been asking about you." Eduardo's chest tightened again, but this time with a different emotion. "I'd like that too," he said, a small smile forming. After a few more minutes of conversation, they said their goodbyes, and Eduardo ended the call. He set the phone down and leaned against the window, staring out at the city below. For the first time in years, he felt as though he had taken a step towards something real, something meaningful. The thought of reconnecting with his family filled him with both hope and a twinge of anxiety. He knew it wouldn't be easy to rebuild the bridges he had burned, but Joseph's words echoed in his mind: start small. A kind word. A small gesture. The rest of the morning passed in quiet reflection. Eduardo cleaned up the dining table, carefully wrapping the leftover food to donate later. As he worked, his thoughts drifted back to the conversation he had shared with Joseph. The janitor's humility, wisdom, and unwavering love for his family had left an indelible mark on Eduardo. When the table was clear, Eduardo sat down at his desk and opened his notebook. He flipped to the list he had started the night before, scanning the names and ideas he had written. Each name represented a relationship he wanted to mend, a person he wanted to reach out to. He began writing letters, his pen moving steadily across the pages. To old friends, he wrote apologies and invitations to reconnect. To former colleagues, he offered gratitude for their support during his rise to success. And to his father, he wrote a heartfelt message expressing his regret for the years they had missed and his desire to make amends. By the time he finished, the sun was high in the sky, casting a bright light over the penthouse. Eduardo stacked the letters neatly, feeling a sense of accomplishment that was different from anything he had experienced in his career. This wasn't about deals or profits, it was about people. Later that afternoon, Eduardo made his way to the lobby, carrying a large bag filled with the leftover food from the feast. Joseph was there, as Eduardo had expected, wiping down the front desk with a familiar diligence. "Joseph," Eduardo called, his voice warm. The janitor looked up and smiled. "Eduardo. Good to see you again." Eduardo held up the bag. "I have some leftovers from last night. I thought you might like to take them home." Joseph's eyes widened in surprise, and he walked over to take the bag. "That's very kind of you," he said. "Thank you. It's the least I can do," Eduardo said, his tone sincere. "And I also wanted to thank you again for last night. You didn't have to spend your evening with me, but you did, and it meant more than you know." Joseph waved a hand dismissively. "It was a good night. And I think it did us both some good." Eduardo nodded, his smile growing. "It did," he agreed. "And I've been thinking. I want to do more. Not just for myself, but for others. You've inspired me to look at things differently." Joseph tilted his head slightly, his expression curious. "What do you mean?" "I've spent so much of my life focused on the big picture," Eduardo explained. "Chasing success, building an empire, all of that. But I've forgotten the small things that actually matter, the people, the connections, the simple acts of kindness. I want to change that." Joseph's smile widened, and he nodded approvingly. "That's a good place to start, Eduardo. One step at a time." As Eduardo left the lobby and stepped out into the crisp December air, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The city buzzed with life around him, and for the first time, he felt like he was truly part of it, not as a distant observer, but as someone who could make a difference. He walked with a lighter step, his mind racing with ideas for the future. There were so many ways to give back, to build something meaningful beyond the walls of his penthouse. And as he moved through the bustling streets, Eduardo knew one thing for certain: this Christmas had been unlike any other. It had been a beginning. The city's vibrant hum filled Eduardo's ears as he wandered through the streets of Miami. The crisp December air carried the faint scent of salt from the ocean, mingling with the aromas of food carts and the chatter of pedestrians. For the first time in years, Eduardo was walking without a destination. He wasn't rushing to a meeting, preparing for a deal, or calculating his next big move. Instead, he was simply existing, present in a world he had long overlooked. His thoughts kept circling back to the events of the past night. The conversation with Joseph, the laughter over dinner, and the wisdom woven into the janitor's simple words, all of it had shaken something loose in Eduardo. For so long, he had believed that wealth and power were the ultimate measures of success, but now those ideas felt hollow. He passed a small park where families were gathered, children chasing each other around a Christmas tree adorned with colorful lights. Eduardo slowed his pace, watching as a little girl ran to her father, her laughter echoing in the crisp air. The man lifted her into his arms, spinning her around as she squealed with delight. The sight stirred something deep in Eduardo, a longing he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge before. Turning away, he continued walking until he reached a quiet coffee shop tucked into the corner of a bustling street. The warm glow of its lights and the inviting aroma of freshly brewed coffee drew him in. He ordered a drink and found a seat by the window, pulling his notebook from his coat pocket, flipping to the pages he had filled earlier. Eduardo reread the list of names and actions. Each one felt like a step toward a life he had lost sight of, a life filled with connection, purpose, and meaning. He tapped his pen against the edge of the notebook, his mind wandering to the conversations he would need to have. Some would be simple, a phone call, a message, a small gesture to show he cared. Others would be harder. There were people he had hurt, relationships he had neglected to the point of breaking. He knew that some wounds wouldn't heal overnight, but Joseph's words echoed in his mind, "It's not about being perfect. It's about trying." Eduardo began writing again, this time expanding on his ideas. He jotted down plans for charitable projects, ways to give back to the community that had supported his rise to success. He thought about Joseph's family in Cuba, about the struggles of immigrant workers trying to provide for their loved ones. Eduardo realized he had the resources to make a real difference, not just through donations but by creating opportunities, scholarships, housing programs, job training initiatives. As he wrote, the noise of the coffee shop faded into the background. The sound of cups clinking, quiet conversations, and the hiss of the espresso machine became a soothing rhythm as Eduardo poured his thoughts onto the page. Hours passed before he looked up, surprised to see the sky darkening outside. The city was beginning to come alive again, the streets filling with people preparing to celebrate the new year. Eduardo closed his notebook and paid for his coffee, stepping out into the bustling streets with a renewed sense of purpose. The walk back to his penthouse felt different this time. Eduardo noticed things he hadn't before, the way the streetlights reflected on the wet pavement, the laughter of strangers as they passed by, the warmth of holiday decorations in shop windows. It was as though the world had shifted, or perhaps he had. When he arrived at his building, the lobby was quiet. The Christmas lights still twinkled on the modest tree in the corner, casting a soft glow over the polished floors. Eduardo paused by the front desk, hoping to see Joseph, but the janitor was nowhere in sight. "He's probably taking a well-deserved rest," Eduardo muttered to himself, smiling. Upstairs, the penthouse felt less like a cage and more like a blank canvas. Eduardo set his notebook on the coffee table and walked to the window, gazing out at the city below. The view had always been one of his favorite things about the apartment, but tonight, it seemed to take on new meaning. It wasn't just a vantage point, it was a reminder of the people who made up the city, the lives intertwined in its streets and buildings. The sound of fireworks in the distance pulled Eduardo from his thoughts. He glanced at the clock on the wall, 11:55. 5 minutes to midnight. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found his father's number. His thumb hovered over the call button as doubt crept in. What if his father didn't answer? What if the damage was too great to repair? With a deep breath, Eduardo pressed the button and held the phone to his ear. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. Just as he was about to hang up, a familiar voice answered. "Eduardo," his father said, his tone surprised but steady. "Hi, Dad," Eduardo replied, his voice softer than he intended. "I know it's late, and I know I haven't been great about staying in touch, but I wanted to call." There was a pause on the other end, and Eduardo braced himself for a cold response. Instead, his father said, "I'm glad you did." The simple statement loosened something in Eduardo's chest, and he found himself smiling. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," he said. "About family, about everything I've missed. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, for not being there, for not making time." His father's voice softened. "It's good to hear from you, son. And it's never too late to make time." They spoke for a few more minutes, sharing updates and tentative plans for a visit in the coming weeks. As the call ended, Eduardo felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The clock struck midnight, and the city erupted in celebration. Fireworks lit up the sky, their brilliant colors reflecting off the glass of the penthouse. Eduardo stepped onto the balcony, the cool night air brushing against his face. He watched as the bursts of light painted the city in shades of red, gold, and green, each explosion a reminder of the possibilities the new year held. For the first time in years, Eduardo didn't feel alone. He thought about the conversations he had started, the promises he had made to himself and others. He thought about Joseph, about the lessons he had learned from a man whose kindness had opened his eyes to a different way of living. As the fireworks faded and the city settled into the first moments of the new year, Eduardo made a silent vow. He would keep trying. He would rebuild the bridges he had burned, create opportunities for those who needed them, and never again lose sight of what truly mattered. The year ahead was unwritten, but Eduardo was ready to face it, with hope, with purpose, and with the knowledge that small steps could lead to extraordinary change. The first morning of the new year brought a quiet stillness to Miami. The city, still waking from a night of celebration, felt subdued, as if catching its breath. The sun shone brightly through Eduardo's penthouse windows, casting golden light across the living room. For the first time in what felt like years, Eduardo woke with a sense of calm rather than urgency. Sitting at the edge of his bed, he stared at the city below, sipping coffee from a mug he hadn't used in ages. The sound of waves crashing faintly in the distance reminded him of his childhood holidays by the beach, simple days filled with laughter, sandcastles, and the comforting presence of his family. It had been years since he'd felt anything close to that warmth, but the night with Joseph had stirred something within him. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was a realization that those moments, fleeting and imperfect as they were, had meant more than any deal, property, or bank balance ever could. After finishing his coffee, Eduardo retrieved his notebook from the night before. He sat at his dining table, flipping through the pages filled with names, ideas, and plans. The sunlight streaming through the windows illuminated the words, making them feel more tangible, more urgent. Eduardo started by revisiting the list of names, thinking about the connections he wanted to repair. His sister Sophia had already been a first step, a small but significant victory. Now, he turned to the others. His father, whose quiet disappointment had lingered unspoken between them for years. His old friends, who had gradually stopped inviting him to gatherings when his excuses piled up. He picked up his phone and began composing messages, each one tailored to the person on his list. To his father, Eduardo wrote, "Dad, I know we spoke last night, but I want to say it again, I'm sorry for not being there when it mattered. I want to change that. Let me know when we can meet, just the two of us. I miss you." To an old college friend, Eduardo wrote, "Hey, Mark. It's been way too long. I was thinking about all the times we used to grab beers and talk about starting our businesses. I miss those days, and I miss you. Let's catch up soon. My treat." To another friend, someone he had distanced himself from after their careers diverged, he sent a more reflective message, "Claire, I owe you an apology. I let work consume me, and I let our friendship fade because of it. I hope you can forgive me. I'd love to reconnect if you're open to it." Each message took careful thought. Eduardo wanted to be sincere, but he also knew he couldn't undo years of neglect with a few lines of text. What he could do, however, was take the first step. When the messages were sent, Eduardo leaned back in his chair and exhaled. He felt lighter, as though he had released a part of himself that had been trapped for years. His phone buzzed almost immediately. Sophia replied first, her response simple but heartfelt, "Proud of you, brother. Let me know when you're ready to visit. We'll be waiting with open arms." The second message came from Mark, "Eduardo. I was just thinking about you the other day. Let's definitely catch up, I'm free next week. Name the time and place." Claire's response came shortly after, "Eduardo, I won't lie, it hurt when you pulled away. But I appreciate your message. Let's talk soon." The warmth of their replies filled Eduardo with a sense of hope. For the first time, he realized how much these relationships had meant to him and how much he had missed by letting them drift away. Feeling a surge of motivation, Eduardo turned to the next section of his notebook, the plans for giving back. He started by making a list of local charities and organizations that supported immigrant workers like Joseph. Each entry came with a note about how he could help, whether through donations, partnerships, or direct involvement. One idea stood out, a scholarship fund for children of immigrant families. Eduardo remembered how Joseph had spoken about his daughter's dreams of becoming a teacher and his son's talent for drawing. He imagined what even a small amount of financial support could mean for families like theirs. Eduardo picked up the phone and made his first call of the day. It was to his accountant, a no-nonsense man named Victor who had managed Eduardo's wealth for years. "Victor," Eduardo began, "I need to set up a scholarship fund. Something meaningful, but manageable. Can we meet to discuss the details?" Victor's tone was measured, as always. "Of course, Eduardo. I'll start drafting some options. When would you like to meet?" "Tomorrow morning," Eduardo replied without hesitation. "This is a priority." The call ended, and Eduardo felt a surge of purpose. He wasn't just thinking about change, he was acting on it. Later that afternoon, Eduardo left the penthouse and headed to a nearby shelter. The building was modest, its exterior showing signs of wear, but the energy inside was palpable. Volunteers bustled about, organizing supplies and preparing meals for those in need. Eduardo approached the front desk, where a middle-aged woman with kind eyes greeted him. "Hi," he said, clearing his throat. "I'm Eduardo, and I'd like to help. Is there anything you need?" The woman smiled warmly. "Nice to meet you, Eduardo. We can always use an extra pair of hands. Do you have time to help serve meals?" Eduardo nodded. "I do." For the next few hours, Eduardo worked alongside the volunteers, serving food and chatting with the shelter's guests. The experience was humbling, yet deeply rewarding. He listened to their stories, many of which mirrored Joseph's struggles, sacrifices made for family, resilience in the face of hardship, and a hope for better days. As the day drew to a close, Eduardo returned to the penthouse, physically tired but emotionally energized. The connections he had made, both with the shelter's guests and the volunteers, felt real in a way his business dealings never had. That evening, as Eduardo sat by the window watching the city lights flicker, he thought about Joseph. The janitor's quiet strength and unwavering love for his family had set everything in motion. Eduardo made a mental note to thank him again, not just with words, but with action. The notebook lay open on the coffee table, its pages filled with names, ideas, and plans. For the first time in years, Eduardo didn't feel weighed down by his ambition. Instead, he felt lifted by it, driven by a purpose greater than himself. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Eduardo was ready to face it. He had begun rebuilding the bridges he had burned, and with each step, he felt closer to the life he had forgotten he wanted, a life of connection, compassion, and meaning. As the city settled into the quiet of the night, Eduardo closed the notebook and smiled. This was only the beginning. The days that followed Eduardo's quiet transformation were unlike anything he had experienced before. His mornings no longer began with rushed meetings and meticulously scheduled calls, but with a sense of calm and purpose. Instead of poring over market reports and investment portfolios, Eduardo spent his time reaching out to people, rekindling relationships, and putting his newfound plans into action. The first step was fulfilling his promise to himself, reconnecting with family. Eduardo booked a flight to visit Sofia and their father the following week. He made sure to confirm the date with Sofia first, who seemed thrilled at the prospect. "Dad will be so happy to see you," she said over the phone. "It's been far too long." Eduardo's heart warmed at her words. He knew the visit wouldn't erase the years of distance, but it was a step in the right direction. He planned to arrive with no business in mind, no distractions, just himself, ready to listen and rebuild the trust he had neglected. In the meantime, Eduardo began finalizing the details of the scholarship fund he had envisioned. He met with Victor, his accountant, and a few local educators to discuss how best to structure the program. They decided to focus on children of immigrant families, offering financial support to those who showed exceptional promise but lacked the resources to pursue higher education. "I want this to be personal," Eduardo said during one of their meetings. "I don't just want to write checks. I want to meet these kids, hear their stories, and see how we can help them grow." Victor, who had known Eduardo for years, raised an eyebrow at his newfound passion. "You've changed," he said, not unkindly. Eduardo smiled faintly. "I think I'm finally figuring out what matters." The fund was named the Lucia and Diego Scholarship Program in honor of Joseph's children, whose dreams had inspired Eduardo to act. When Eduardo informed Joseph about the program during one of their encounters in the lobby, the janitor's reaction was one of shock and gratitude. "You didn't have to do this," Joseph said, his voice trembling as he clutched the brochure Eduardo handed him. "No," Eduardo replied, "but I wanted to. You and your family reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that we all have the power to make a difference." Joseph shook his head, smiling through the tears that had formed in his eyes. "You've done something incredible, Eduardo. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart." Eduardo felt a swell of pride, not the kind that came from closing a deal or acquiring a new property, but the kind that came from knowing he had truly helped someone. As the scholarship program took shape, Eduardo began making changes to his personal life as well. He spent time decluttering his penthouse, removing the excessive luxuries that no longer held meaning for him. He replaced some of the sterile decor with family photos, artwork from local artists, and small reminders of the life he wanted to build. One morning, while rearranging the living room, Eduardo found an old photo album tucked away in a drawer. He sat down on the couch and flipped through its pages, his fingers brushing over the worn edges. The images transported him back to simpler times, holidays spent with his parents and sister, childhood birthdays, and vacations filled with laughter and joy. One photo, in particular, caught his attention. It was of him and his mother sitting at the piano. He was no older than 10, his small hands resting on the keys as his mother beamed beside him. The memory brought a lump to his throat, and he realized how much he missed the music that had once been such an important part of his life. That evening, Eduardo returned to the piano for the first time since his mother's passing. The notes came slowly at first, his fingers fumbling over the keys, but as he played, the familiar rhythms began to flow. The music filled the penthouse, turning the once empty space into something alive and vibrant. Eduardo's days continued to take on a new rhythm. He dedicated time to volunteering at the local shelter, where he had begun to form connections with both the staff and the people they served. Each conversation, each shared smile, reinforced his belief in the power of small, genuine acts of kindness. One afternoon, while serving meals at the shelter, Eduardo met a young woman named Elena. She was soft-spoken but had a fierce determination in her eyes as she told him about her dream of starting a small bakery. "I've always loved baking," she said, her hands clasped tightly together. "But it feels so far out of reach sometimes. It's hard to know where to start." Eduardo listened intently, asking questions about her ideas and offering encouragement. He left the shelter that day with a plan to connect Elena with local business resources that could help her get started. For Eduardo, moments like these were becoming the highlights of his life. He found joy in seeing others succeed, in knowing that his wealth and influence could be used to uplift rather than isolate. As the weeks went on, Eduardo's efforts began to ripple outward. The scholarship fund gained traction, attracting attention from other philanthropists who wanted to contribute. His messages to old friends turned into phone calls, then coffee meetings, then plans for larger gatherings. His visit to Sofia and his father was another milestone. Though the reunion was emotional, it was also filled with laughter and shared memories. His father, a man of few words, placed a hand on Eduardo's shoulder at the end of the visit and said, "I'm proud of you, son. It's good to have you back." Those words stayed with Eduardo as he returned to Miami, fueling his commitment to continue the journey he had started. One evening, as Eduardo sat on the balcony of his penthouse, looking out at the city lights, he thought about the road ahead. He knew there would be challenges, times when his old habits and doubts might resurface. But he also knew he wasn't alone. He had his family, his friends, and the countless people whose lives he hoped to touch through his work. The skyline stretched before him, a canvas of endless possibilities. Eduardo closed his eyes and took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. This was the life he wanted to build, a life of connection, compassion, and purpose. And for the first time, Eduardo knew he was ready to face it. As the city settled into the quiet hum of night, Eduardo opened his notebook and began writing again. Each word, each idea, felt like a step toward a brighter future, and in the soft glow of the Miami lights, Eduardo smiled. This was only the beginning. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your favorite part in the comments below. Your support means so much to us. See you in the next video.